Okay, Mr. Mamel, what is your current name, age, and occupation?
I'm Bruce Mamel. I'm 62. I'm a teacher at Millbrook High School. Hi, Desiree.
Where did you live during the war?
I lived in Minneapolis mostly as a child.
What was your age when the Vietnam War ended, which was
Um,
1974?
it started in 65 and it ended in about 73, so I was about 10 when it started and I was about 18 when it stopped.
What were you doing during the time the war occurred?
I was just a kid going to school, like you.
So, did you see any effect of, did it affect you at school or your classmates?
No, because I lived in Minneapolis, we lived in a suburb, and I didn't know anybody personally who was in the war. So it was just like you guys. It was like you don't know anything about Syria or the Middle East, or you just go about your life. So I was just going about my life like anybody else.
So it didn't affect your family or personal life at all?
No, I mean, not not in any way that like I said, I didn't know anybody who got drafted or was in the war.
Why do you think the United States got involved in the war?
Well, I know exactly why, because I'm a history teacher. So in 1954, when the French got defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, they bailed out because they were fighting the Vietnamese, and because it had been their colony, and the Vietnamese had Ho Chi Minh had gone to the Treaty of Versailles, and then also after World War II, and said, hey, we want our independence, and they wouldn't give it to them because they wanted them to be under the thumb of the French colony still. And they said, okay, fine, we'll fight you for it. So they were fighting a war of nationalism, but they just happened to be communists. And so after the war, we were worried about the spread of communism, and we started this theory. It was this policy called containment, where we were going to stop communism wherever it spread to, because it was virulent and oppressive, and it was us, the free world, versus the Russians, the communist world, who were kind of like the two dominant powers after the war. So we stepped in the 50s with aid, we gave them food and education and stuff, but the CIA was in there monitoring things, and there were some guns and stuff, but we propped up the South Vietnamese regime at the time, and eventually they said we weren't going to get into the war, but in 1965 we got into we formally got into the war because the story was that there was a destroyer called the Maddox, which was in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is up north, and they said they shot at it with a torpedo boat or something, and we didn't declare war, we just said we're going to war. We're going to go stop the spread of communism in Vietnam. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're an expert now, but at the time, did you know any information?
I didn't know any of that, no, not as a child. I mean, all I knew was that we were in this war. Yeah.
Gotcha.
There's a bunch of different questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you can ask different ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So, oh my gosh. How it's slipping.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. How is this war different than other wars the U.S. has been involved with around the world?
Well, World War I and World War II were basically battles for the soul of civilization. And this was an undeclared war, meaning that it wasn't authorized from the standpoint of, Congress and all that stuff, but they decided to get into this business of stopping communism. And we haven't had any declared wars since. In fact, North Korea was another undeclared war where we were stopping the spread of communism on the Korean Peninsula. which to this day we have troops at the 38th parallel, which basically chops North and South Korea in half. So North Korea is communist, South Korea is free, and we got a bunch of troops on the border. So the Gulf Wars were not wars of, they weren't, and the war in Afghanistan, they weren't, declared wars. We were chasing the terrorists and, promoting regime change based on who we thought was not a terrorist. So, but World War I and World War II are global wars. These are Vietnam was a localized war. I mean, they were a little worried that it was going to spread to the rest of Southeast Asia. They called it the domino theory, that if one country fell to communism, then they'd all fall to communism. So that was the prevailing idea anyway.
So was there any type of propaganda during the war?
Yeah, the media at first was, I was 10, so I mean, I read Time magazine and it was in the news, and we did some stuff in social studies, but it wasn't like it was like a really big deal. And so they were generally supportive of the war, but over time what happened was that that support turned until by the time I was your age. Well, let's back up. When I was a kid, my dad had been in the Air Force, my grandfather had been in World War I, and it was yay rah rah America after the World War II. So it was like, that would have been like 20 years after the end of World War II. So those guys from World War II would have been like in their mid-40s. So patriotism was extremely strong. So if you'd said to me when I was 7 years old, like, hey, do you want to join the Army? I'd be like gung-ho, like, yeah, let's go. But by the time I was your age, 18, the tide had turned against the war completely. So the propaganda was basically anti-war protesting then, at that time. I mean, there was a lot of anti-war protesting starting in the late 60s. So.
Did you personally witness any protests or any events that?
No, there were protests down at the University of Minnesota, but I didn't go down to those. I was probably 14 maybe, 15 maybe. But I had a friend, my neighbor, his older sister was, I guess, in college then, so I guess she went. There were college protests on the college campuses.
How was the leadership of the country/military during this time?
Well, started off with Kennedy in the 60s. Everybody loved him. Everybody thought, oh, this young, handsome guy, and he can do no wrong or whatever. Well, then he gets killed. And then Johnson becomes president, and Johnson says, we're not going to Vietnam. And then that was in about 64-ish. He gets elected because Kennedy got shot in 63. So in 68, Johnson said he wasn't going to run. But in 64, he said, we're not going to Vietnam. Well, in 65, we went to Vietnam. And there's some question as to whether or not Kennedy would have gone to Vietnam. Because we were already in there with the CIA and giving him money and giving him supplies and all that stuff. So, but the leadership at first was seen as sort of, World War II-ish, like my country, right or wrong, we're going to go stop communism. But in 68, Nixon got elected. In 72, he got reelected. And in 74, Watergate happened. Well, Watergate happened actually in 72, but it took 2 years to get rid of him. And so people were really sour at that time. I mean, I want to say Nixon's approval rating even when he resigned was maybe 30-40% maybe still. Mm-hmm. But he resigned. So people were very angry, and they were very angry at the leadership. The general was a guy named William Westmoreland, and after a while, people just started to say, like, what are we doing here? Like, why are we in this little country 10,000 miles away? So.
In what ways did the war change the world?
Well, I don't know about changing the whole world. It certainly changed the way America thought about war, and that is still, I maintain that is still the case today. It's a volunteer military now. We don't ask anything of you or anything of anybody. I had to register for the draft in '73 as a senior in high school, and they stopped the draft. But the idea, like, gosh, this war started when I was 10, and now I'm 18, and I might actually get drafted and have to go to this war. Like, what's that all about, right? Why aren't we done with this thing? Even though the recent Gulf War was the longest one. But, what else? What was the question again? I got off the track there.
What ways did the war change?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. Well, America was seen as the strongest, freest country. So when we left Vietnam, people were like, why did the biggest, strongest, freest country have to bail out of this little place in the middle of nowhere? Well, we lost about 58,000 guys. People didn't care anymore about this place halfway around the world. The Vietnamese lost about 1 million people, but they were fighting a war of nationalism. So it's not like it gave all these other little countries the notion like, oh yeah, we're all going to demand our freedom or whatever. But it was seen as a victory for communism. You know, like, okay, they won that round there. So there were other places in the world that were still struggling with the idea, should we be free or should we be communist? And so we still spent time addressing that, even up into the 80s.
So do you think the reason why the leader of North Vietnam said that North South lost, but America was defeated because they are one of the strongest countries, but they dropped out of the war for whatever reason?
Okay, say that again now.
So North Vietnam, the leader, I don't know how to
Ho
pronounce
Chi Minh.
Yeah. He said that North South Vietnam had a victory nor lost, but America did. So do you think...
Yeah, they had a victory because we left.
Yeah.
I mean, they called it a victory.
Gotcha. So other than the draft changing, is anything else still a change from that war? Are there any other changes from the war?
Well, we don't treat the homeless. We don't treat Vietnam veterans very well at all. The World War II guys, that was like a big deal. You had Memorial Day and Veterans Day, and there were parades, and they wore their uniforms, and people were very patriotic. And I mean, it's almost quaint to talk about it now because nobody really cares now. I mean, there's a handful of people that care, and these days the military gets a lot more respect than it did during that time, though, because the veterans came home to a country that was very divided about the war and didn't like it, and they wanted out, so they treated the vets badly. I mean, it was like you were like this loser for going over there, whereas at the beginning of the war you were still a hero and a patriot and those sorts of things. And I just saw a thing on the news last night. There's a bunch of homeless vets in Portland, Oregon, and they're addressing the issue, but they have a lot of homeless Vietnam veterans and homeless veterans in general, apparently. So that's a problem, you know. And medical care for vets has been a problem for decades. So people are like, what's up with that? These guys go over there and get shot to pieces and get hurt and all this other stuff, and we're not taking care of them. So that's a current debate that makes a lot of people really angry. That, you know, here these people are working. I mean, you know, they're protecting you and me, and all that good stuff. And what do? We don't treat them very well at all. So.
Do you think another war will occur that would be similar to the Vietnam War?
Well, we're in the Middle East right now, and we're in Afghanistan. We've been in Afghanistan since 2001, since basically 9/11, basically. We got out of Iraq, more or less, but we're over there doing little things with Syria, supporting supporting the various factions that are fighting back against the Syrian regime, but we're still in Afghanistan. Not a presence, not like we were, but we're still there. So you're going to fight these little wars against terrorists, which aren't nation states. They're groups, and that changes the nature of warfare. Period. But as far as like a big ticket, here we come, ready or not, I can't imagine anywhere where America would want to go right now. Like if you said we're going to go to Indonesia to stop the spread of communism, would we want to go there? And I doubt that people would say, they'd say, it's a bunch of islands, there's 1,000 islands in the middle of the South Pacific, knock yourself out, and whatever. You're just not going to get that level of engagement like you did during World War II or even later on. I mean, Korea or the early days of Vietnam. So I guess I don't see that. I don't see a country wanting to go against us in that regard and go like completely communist or something. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't know. We certainly won't let it happen in this hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere. We stopped it in the 80s. There were some problems in the Caribbean and Central America, so we went down there.
Do you have anything else that would be beneficial for my class to know about the Vietnam
I don't know.
War?
I mean, it's important for you guys to study these wars because, your freedom and democracy are a result of war, really, and understanding like what does it mean to be an American, right? And what is my civic duty or my obligation, or how should I engage as a citizen? Those are all important things that we try to teach you guys here. The military is absolutely positively necessary. You have to have a really strong military so that nobody can threaten you, because if you show any sign of weakness, they'll take advantage of it. And the Russians are sort of notorious for that. That's partly why we've got some problems in the Middle East right now, because they're starting to they see an opening. So they're starting to extend their feelers in there. So now what do? Now we got to go back to this business of, do we care whether the Russians have a client state in Syria right on the Mediterranean, right? Do we care or not? So those are big ticket questions, but for you guys, that's really, it's always going to be that struggle. And it's not so much military warfare now as it is economic warfare. You get a favorable trade balance, man, you can run up the bill on a country in a heartbeat like us. Anyway, does that help?
Yes.
Yay, how's your project? Yay, is it done?
Thank you, Mr. Mamel.
You're welcome.